Every war in history has two battlefields. One is visible, soldiers, weapons, destroyed cities. The other is invisible, but in many ways more devastating and longer lasting. The economic battlefield, where currencies collapse, savings disappear, supply chains break, and the financial damage outlasts the fighting by decades. This video is about that second battlefield. Not the politics, not the blame, just the financial mechanics, what actually happens to an economy when a country goes to war, step by step, with real numbers from real history. 5 mechanisms, each one measurable, each one documented across every major conflict in the last 100 years. Before the first bullet is fired, the economy is already changing. Government spending spikes, bond markets move, currency traders react, commodity prices shift. Markets do not wait for war to start. They price in the probability of war weeks or months before it begins. In every documented conflict, the financial system begins adjusting the moment war becomes likely, not the moment it starts. The economy reads the signal before the soldier hears the order. The first mechanism, and the most immediate, is the destruction of productive capacity. Every economy runs on 3 things: people who work, physical capital like factories and infrastructure, and the institutions that coordinate them, banks, contracts, property rights. War attacks all 3 simultaneously. Workers are killed, injured, conscripted, or displaced. In major 20th century conflicts, labor forces shrank by 10 to 25% within 2 years of war beginning. That is not just a human tragedy, it is a direct reduction in an economy's ability to produce anything. Physical capital, factories, roads, ports, power grids, hospitals, is destroyed either by direct attack or by diversion of resources away from maintenance toward military use. Infrastructure that took decades to build can be destroyed in days. And unlike soldiers, infrastructure cannot be replaced by training new recruits. A destroyed bridge takes years to rebuild. A collapsed power grid takes months just to partially restore. The third destruction, institutions, is the slowest and most damaging. When property rights break down, when contracts cannot be enforced, when the banking system stops functioning, economic activity does not slow, it stops. Historical data across major conflicts shows GDP losses of 20 to 50% in active war zones within 3 years of conflict beginning. Some economies took a decade or longer to return to pre-war output levels. Some never did. The 3 channels of war finance produce a predictable sequence. First, taxes rise and bond issuance begins. Bond markets absorb initial borrowing. Interest rates on government debt increase as the volume of bonds grows, and lenders demand higher compensation for risk. Second, as the war continues and costs mount, money creation begins. The money supply expands. Inflation accelerates. The real value of existing debt is gradually eroded, which is, from the government's perspective, one of the hidden benefits of inflation. The real burden of debt shrinks as the currency loses value. Third, post-war fiscal adjustment. Governments emerge from conflict with massive debts, damaged economies, and reduced tax bases. The combination produces years of austerity, elevated inflation, or both. The people who bear the cost of this sequence are ordinary savers and wage earners whose savings lose value to inflation and whose incomes are compressed by high taxation and slow growth in the post-war period. The third mechanism, trade disruption and the collapse of the globalized economy that war produces. Modern economies are deeply interconnected. Countries specialize in what they produce efficiently and trade for what others produce more efficiently. This specialization, the basis of comparative advantage, produces significant gains in living standards that most people take entirely for granted. War shatters these networks with immediate effect. Shipping lanes become dangerous or impassable. Insurance for vessels transiting conflict zones becomes prohibitively expensive or unavailable. Ports that handle international trade become military targets. Sanctions cut off trade between combatants and their allies. Export controls restrict the flow of technology, components, and raw materials. The consequence is forced self-sufficiency. Countries must attempt to produce domestically what they previously imported efficiently. This production is almost always more expensive, less efficient, and lower quality than the imported equivalent. The economic cost is the difference between what self-sufficient domestic production costs and what efficient international trade would have provided. Across an entire economy, this gap is enormous. Energy is the most critical traded commodity and the one where disruption is most immediately felt. Economies that import energy see energy costs spike as supply routes are disrupted. Higher energy costs flow through every sector: manufacturing, transport, agriculture, heating. The inflation produced by energy supply disruption is particularly difficult for central banks to address because it originates in supply constraints rather than demand excess. Food is the second critical commodity. Agricultural supply chains require fertilizers, fuel for machinery, transport networks, and stable property rights over farmland. War disrupts all of these. The result, documented in every major conflict, is food price inflation, and in severe cases, famine in affected regions. The fourth mechanism, capital flight and investment collapse, completes the picture of economic destruction. Investment requires confidence in the future. Businesses invest when they believe their investments will generate returns. Foreign investors allocate capital to countries where property rights are secure, contracts are enforceable, and political stability is credible. War destroys all of these conditions simultaneously. Domestic businesses stop investing. The future is too uncertain. Foreign investors withdraw. Capital flows out of the country to safer jurisdictions. The currency depreciates as capital leaves. Depreciation makes imports more expensive, feeding inflation further. The banking system, under stress from non-performing loans and capital outflows, contracts its lending, reducing the credit available to businesses trying to survive. The result is a compounding negative cycle. Less investment means less productive capacity. Less productive capacity means less output. Less output means less tax revenue. Less tax revenue means less ability to service debt. Rising debt service costs mean less government spending on everything else. This cycle is why post-war economic recovery takes so long. It is not simply a matter of rebuilding physical infrastructure. The confidence, the institutional trust, the investment networks, the human capital, all must be rebuilt simultaneously. Physical infrastructure can be rebuilt in years. Institutional trust can take decades. 6 things to understand about how war destroys economies and why the damage lasts far longer than the fighting. 1. War destroys productive capacity on 3 levels simultaneously: the workforce through casualties, displacement, and conscription, physical capital through direct destruction and diversion, and institutions through the breakdown of property rights, contracts, and financial systems. GDP contractions of 20 to 50% in active conflict zones are historically documented. 2. Governments finance wars through taxation, borrowing, and money creation. Each channel has a different economic consequence. Money creation, printing money, produces inflation that destroys the savings of ordinary people while eroding the real value of government debt. The middle class, whose wealth is held in cash and bonds, suffers most. 3. War shatters global trade networks built on comparative advantage and efficient specialization. Forced self-sufficiency is always more expensive than efficient trade. Energy and food, the most critical traded commodities, see the most immediate and severe price disruptions. 4. Capital flight and investment collapse compound the productive capacity destruction. Investment requires confidence. War destroys confidence. The resulting negative cycle, less investment, less output, less tax revenue, less ability to service debt, is why economic recovery takes years to decades after fighting stops. 5. The financial damage of war almost always exceeds the direct physical damage of the fighting. The destruction of institutions, trade networks, and investment confidence is economically larger than the destruction of physical infrastructure. 6. The people who bear the greatest economic burden of war are not those directing it. They are ordinary savers whose savings are inflated away, workers whose labor markets are destroyed, and future generations who inherit the debt. Understanding these financial mechanics, separate from any political position on any specific conflict, is the foundation of understanding how wars reshape economies for decades after they end. Every war has a financial bill. It arrives in the form of destroyed productive capacity, government debt, inflation, broken trade networks, and collapsed investment. The bill is paid, not always those who incurred it, over years and decades after the fighting stops. Understanding these mechanics does not require a political position on any conflict. It requires only the willingness to follow the numbers. If this gave you a clearer picture, hit like and subscribe to FINOBOARD. In every video, we decode one financial system with real numbers and no agenda. Share this with one person who has never seen the economic cost of war assembled in one place.